The most expensive mistake my son ever made lasted less than 10 seconds. It happened in a courtroom in Larimer County, Colorado at exactly 9:17 on a Tuesday morning. His attorney stood up, straightened a navy blue blazer that probably cost more than my first pickup truck, and told the judge that I had virtually no assets left to manage. My son smiled. I did too. The difference was that I knew something neither of them knew. My accountant was sitting in the row directly behind her, holding 18 months of records that were about to turn that hearing upside down. And that wasn't even the worst secret waiting in the room. Before we get into this story, tell me where you're watching from and what your local time is right now. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel. And if you like real family stories about betrayal, resilience, and the occasional quiet comeback, consider subscribing to the channel. But to understand why my son was smiling that morning, you need to go back 18 months. 18 months earlier, my life was about as exciting as a weather report in Colorado. My name is Kevin Brooks. I was 69 years old at the time, widowed for 4 years, and living alone in a modest ranch-style house on the west side of Fort Collins, about 10 minutes from Horsetooth Reservoir, if traffic behaved itself. Most mornings followed the same routine. I woke up at 5:45. My knees informed me of the weather before any meteorologist could. I made coffee strong enough to remove paint from a fence. Then I drove my silver 2009 Toyota Tacoma down College Avenue to Silver Grill Cafe. If you've never been there, it's one of those places where the waitresses know your order before you sit down. Every Tuesday and Thursday, Linda and I used to eat breakfast there. After she passed away, I kept going. Not because I liked being reminded of what I lost, because I was afraid of forgetting. There's a difference. I need you to understand something before we go further. People hear that I was a forensic auditor and imagine some kind of financial detective from television. That wasn't my life. Most of my career involved staring at spreadsheets, tax records, payroll reports, and enough bank statements to kill a horse from boredom. I wasn't exciting. I was patient, and sometimes patience is far more dangerous, but we'll get to that later. Back then, my biggest daily decision was whether to order pancakes or eggs. Usually eggs won. Age makes practical people out of most of us. At 7:15 every morning, Nancy Parker would appear carrying a coffee mug the size of a flower pot. Nancy owned a diner 3 blocks away, and had been my friend for over 25 years. She was 66, stubborn loud, and somehow knew everybody's business before they did. "Morning, Kevin," she'd say. "Morning, Nancy. You still driving that Tacoma? It still starts. You still wearing that jacket? It still fits." That was a complete conversation by our standards. People sometimes assume loneliness means being alone. That's not true. Some of the loneliest people I know are surrounded by others. After Linda died, I wasn't lonely all the time. I was simply missing someone. There's a difference there, too. Every room in my house carried traces of her. The ceramic bowl by the front door, the yellow cookbook with handwritten notes in the margins, the blue blanket folded over the couch, the little habits that survive after people don't. Sometimes I'd catch myself turning toward the passenger seat to tell her something while driving. Then I'd remember. 4 years later, that still happened. Less often, but it happened. Ryan called me every couple of weeks. My son lived in Denver with his wife Ashley and their daughter Emma. Ryan was 41, successful, confident, well-dressed, the kind of man who owned several suits more expensive than my entire wardrobe. When he was a little boy, he used to follow me around the garage asking questions about everything. Why do tires wear out? How do engines work? Why do taxes exist? I never had a good answer for that last one. But he was curious, good-hearted, Funny. The kind of kid every parent hopes stays exactly the way he is. Life had other plans. Success changed Ryan gradually. Not overnight. Not dramatically. More like rust. A little at a time. The first thing that disappeared was patience. The second was humility. Then came the habit of measuring everything in dollars. Conversations changed. When he called, it wasn't usually to talk. It was to update. You know that look people get when they're mentally checking their watch during a conversation? Ryan had developed the phone version of it. Busy day today, Dad. Good. Closed another property. Congratulations. Market's still strong. That's nice. Sometimes our calls felt less like family and more like quarterly earnings reports. Still, he was my son. And being disappointed in someone doesn't stop you from loving them. If anything, it makes the whole thing hurt more. A few months before everything started, Ryan invited me to Denver for Emma's 12th birthday. That was one invitation I never turned down. Emma was different. Thank God. She had her grandmother's kindness. She still hugged people with her whole body. Still laughed with her whole face. Still thought spending time with Grandpa was more important than social media. Miracles happen. At the birthday party, Ryan spent most of the afternoon discussing real estate. Ashley discussed renovations. One kitchen island apparently cost more than my first house payment. I nodded politely, then escaped outside with Emma. We sat on the back patio eating vanilla ice cream. She asked me if clouds weighed anything. That was a much better conversation. When I got home that evening, I found myself thinking about how different Ryan had become. Not bad, just different. That's important. Because villains in real life rarely wake up and decide to become villains. Most people simply convince themselves they're entitled to something. And entitlement can do remarkable damage. At the time, though, I didn't think we were heading toward a courtroom. I didn't think lawyers would become involved. I certainly didn't think my own son would eventually sit across from me while arguing I couldn't manage my own life. None of that seemed possible. Looking back, the warning signs were there. Small ones, easy to dismiss. A strange question here, an unusual comment there. Nothing dramatic, nothing obvious. The kind of things you only recognize after the puzzle is finished. One Saturday morning, about 18 months before that courtroom hearing, Ryan called while I was replacing a broken sprinkler head in the backyard. I remember the exact time. 10:43 a.m. I remember because dirt was all over my hands, and I almost let the call go to voicemail. Almost. Hey, Dad. Morning. You busy? Depends. Doing what? Trying to lose a fight with a sprinkler system. He laughed. A real laugh. The old Ryan. For a second it felt good. Then his voice changed. Not dramatically. Just enough. The way salespeople sound, right before they ask something important. And that was when he asked the first question. The question that seemed harmless. The question that started everything. The question about my finances. At the time, I barely thought about it. A month later, I would remember every word. And that's where this story truly begins. Actually, Dad, I've been meaning to ask you something. Those were the exact words. Simple, friendly, completely harmless on the surface. I was standing in my backyard with a muddy sprinkler head in one hand and a crescent wrench in the other. That's usually how questions start, I said. Ryan chuckled. Then came the first question. So, have you ever updated your estate planning stuff after Mom passed? I remember pausing. Not because the question was offensive, because it was unusually specific. Most people ask, "How are your finances?" Ryan asked about estate planning. There's a difference. A few things, I said. You probably should make sure everything's organized. I appreciate the concern. You know what I mean. Not really. He laughed again, but this time it sounded forced. Just thinking ahead. Thinking ahead. You'll hear those words several times in this story. Whenever someone repeats the same phrase often enough, pay attention. Sometimes they're trying to convince themselves. Not you. At the time, I didn't think much about it. After all, I was 69. Estate planning wasn't exactly a strange topic. The conversation moved on, or at least I thought it did. 3 days later, Ryan called again. That was unusual. Normally, 2 conversations in a single week meant somebody was getting married, arrested, or selling a house. Hey, Dad, everything okay? Yeah, just checking in. Then came another question. Casual, smooth. So that cabin in Estes Park, still in your name. There it was again. Specific. Very specific. Now for context, the cabin wasn't some luxury mountain mansion. Linda and I bought it 31 years earlier. 2 bedrooms, 1 stone fireplace, a small deck overlooking a stand of pine trees. Nothing fancy. The roof leaked twice. The water heater failed every winter at the most inconvenient moment possible. And the chipmunks considered themselves co-owners. But it mattered. Linda loved that place. Ryan had spent summers there as a kid. Emma loved it too. Still mine, I said. You ever think about selling? No. Market's really strong right now. I still don't want to sell. Just saying. I could hear something underneath his voice. Disappointment. Small, but present. Then the conversation ended. Again, I told myself it meant nothing. Stay with me here. 1 strange question can be random. 2 strange questions can be coincidence. 3, that's where my old instincts started waking up. The 3rd call came 8 days later. This time, Ashley was on speaker. Hi, Kevin. Hi, Ashley. We were talking about retirement planning. No, they weren't. Not really. But that's how they framed it. Ashley asked whether I still had my Vanguard account. Ryan asked whether I had consolidated any investments. Ashley asked whether I still carried life insurance. Ryan asked whether my property taxes had increased. Question after question. One after another, like a checklist. And suddenly something felt wrong. I didn't answer directly. That's an old auditor habit. When people ask questions, answer the question behind the question. What brought this on? I asked. Silence. Just for a moment. Then Ryan spoke. We worry about you. I almost laughed. Not because concern is funny, because concern usually starts with questions like, how's your health? How are you sleeping? Do you need anything? It doesn't usually begin with, what's the balance of your investment accounts? You know that look people get when they think they're being subtle. I could hear that look through the phone. The call ended 20 minutes later. Afterward, I sat in my kitchen staring at the coffee maker. The house was quiet. The clock above the stove read 8:14 p.m. Outside, a pickup truck rolled past. Inside, something didn't sit right. Not enough to alarm me. Just enough to bother me. Like a pebble inside a shoe. The next morning, I mentioned it to Nancy. Big mistake. Nancy treated suspicious behavior the way bloodhounds treat scents. What exactly did he ask? She said. We were sitting at Silver Grill. She had pancakes. I had eggs. The natural order of the universe. I repeated the questions. Every one of them. Nancy stopped chewing. That alone was concerning. Kevin? What? That's not concern. Maybe it is. No. Nancy, nobody asks about Vanguard accounts because they're worried you're lonely. I laughed. She didn't. You're overthinking it. Maybe. But her expression said otherwise. Nancy had known Ryan since he was 12. She wasn't judging him. She was noticing. There's a difference. The following weekend, I drove to Denver. Emma had a school choir performance. I wasn't going to miss it. After the performance, Ryan invited me back to the house. Ashley had renovated half the kitchen. Again. I couldn't tell what had changed. Everything looked expensive. That's all I knew. At one point, Ryan handed me a beer and joined me on the patio. The evening was pleasant, warm, the sun setting behind neighboring rooftops. Then came another question. So, Dad, there it was, that tone. You ever think about simplifying things? Simplifying what? The house, the cabin, the investments. I took a sip. Why? Less stress. For who? He smiled. Not naturally, carefully. For everybody. Everybody. Interesting word. I looked at him. Really looked at him. And for the first time I noticed something. Ryan wasn't asking because he needed information. He was asking because he already had plans. He was measuring, estimating, evaluating, the way investors evaluate property, the way buyers evaluate inventory. The realization hit softly. Not like a punch, more like cold air entering a room. I still didn't think he was trying to hurt me. I want to be clear about that. I thought he was becoming overly interested in what would eventually happen after I was gone. That's not the same thing. One is human, the other is dangerous. But greed doesn't arrive all at once. It arrives in layers, and Ryan was only beginning to show me the first layer. That night, after driving back to Fort Collins, I couldn't sleep. At 11:42 p.m. I got out of bed. I walked into my small home office. The room hadn't changed much since retirement. Metal filing cabinets, old desk, financial records, tax folders, a framed photograph of Linda smiling beside the Estes Park cabin. I sat down, opened the bottom drawer, and pulled out a folder I hadn't touched in years. The label read, Brooks Family Assets. Just seeing it made me smile. Old habits die hard. Then I opened it, and for the first time in a very long while, Kevin Brooks stopped thinking like a father and started thinking like a forensic auditor. The funny thing about old instincts is that they never really disappear. They just go dormant, like bears in winter, or my lower back. The moment I opened that folder labeled Brooks Family Assets, something inside me woke up that I hadn't used in years. Not suspicion, discipline. For nearly 35 years I had worked as a forensic auditor. Most people hear that title and imagine dramatic confrontations. Movies have done terrible things to public expectations. My actual career involved fluorescent lighting, stale coffee spreadsheets, and patience. Lots of patience. I spent decades tracking missing money. Not stolen money, necessarily. Just money that people claimed had disappeared. Here's what I learned. Money never disappears. People do. Money leaves footprints, always. It leaves signatures, patterns, timelines, tiny inconsistencies, a number entered twice, a date that doesn't make sense, a transfer that arrives 3 days too early. Human beings lie. Records usually don't. At least, not well. Around midnight, I spread documents across my dining room table. Tax returns, property records, investment statements, insurance policies, trust paperwork, everything. The same way I used to prepare for investigations. One pile for assets, one pile for liabilities, one pile for supporting documents. By 1:30 in the morning, I hadn't found anything unusual, which was expected. I wasn't looking for fraud. I was looking for understanding. There's a difference. The next day, I called the only person I trusted with my finances besides myself, Daniel Carter. Daniel had been my accountant for 22 years. If you've ever wondered what reliability looks like in human form, it's Daniel. He wore the same style of brown loafers every year, owned 7 nearly identical blue shirts, and could remember tax code changes from 15 years earlier better than he remembered birthdays, including his own. When I called, he answered on the second ring. "Daniel? Kevin? Busy? Always. Good. Why is that good? Because if you weren't busy, I'd worry." He sighed. That was Daniel's version of laughter. "What do you need? I'd like to review some things." Silence. Then, what happened? That question told me why Daniel was valuable. Good accountants don't ask what you need, they ask what happened, because they know nobody voluntarily reviews paperwork for fun. At least, nobody healthy. I explained the conversations with Ryan, the questions, the timing, the increasing focus on assets. Daniel listened, didn't interrupt, didn't judge, didn't speculate. When I finished, he said something that stuck with me. "Do you think he's planning something?" "I don't know." "Do you think he could be?" That was a different question, and my answer came a little too quickly. "Maybe." Daniel was quiet. Then I heard keyboard clicks. More silence. Then more keyboard clicks. "What are you doing?" I asked. "Checking something. Should I be concerned?" "You should always be concerned. That's comforting." Again that sigh, laugh. 5 minutes later, he spoke. "Have you shared financial information with Ryan recently?" "No." "Any account access?" "No." "Passwords?" "No." "Power of attorney?" "No." "Beneficiary changes?" "No." Another pause. Then, "Good." I didn't like how he said it. You know that feeling when a mechanic says, "Well, that's good"? It usually means the bad news is still coming. 2 days later, I met Daniel at his office near Harmony Road. The building looked exactly the way accounting offices should look. Boring. Comfortingly boring. Inside, Daniel handed me coffee that tasted like liquid regret. Then he spread several reports across his desk. "Let's start simple," he said. "I like simple. That's why you're not an accountant." Fair point. He showed me a timeline. Nothing dramatic. Just records, dates, public information, things people overlook. Ryan had requested property valuation estimates on the Estes Park cabin twice within 6 months. Not illegal, not unusual, but interesting. He had also contacted a mortgage professional regarding inherited real estate scenarios. Again, not illegal, still interesting. Then there were several inquiries involving estate planning seminars, inheritance tax presentations, wealth transition workshops, individually nothing, together a pattern. Daniel leaned back. "I'm not saying he's doing anything wrong, but I'm saying he's thinking about your assets more than most sons think about their father's assets." There it was, the uncomfortable truth. Still, I wasn't ready to believe the worst, because Ryan wasn't some stranger. He was my son, the little boy who once cried when a bird flew into our garage window, the teenager who worked weekends, mowing lawns to buy his first truck, the young father who called me from the hospital when Emma was born. People are complicated. That's one lesson age teaches you. Nobody is only one thing, not even when they're hurting you. A week later, Nancy found me sitting outside Silver Grill staring into space. That usually attracted her attention. "What's wrong?" "Nothing." "Kevin." "What?" "You've stirred that coffee for 3 minutes." I looked down. She was right. I had. Thinking. Dangerous hobby. I explained what Daniel had found. Nancy listened, then folded her arms. Not a promising sign. "What do you think?" she asked. "I think Ryan is getting too interested in money." "You think that's all?" "I don't know." Nancy nodded slowly, then said something I didn't want to hear. "Maybe you don't want to know." That landed harder than I expected, because she was right. Part of me was avoiding conclusions. Not because evidence was missing, because love was present. Love complicates analysis. Numbers don't care who signs them. parents do. A few days later, Daniel called again. This time, his voice sounded different, more serious. "Kevin, what's up?" I found something else. My stomach tightened. "What?" "A public records request involving your Estes Park property." I sat up straighter. "What kind of request?" "Ownership history." That got my attention. "Who requested it?" "Can't prove it." "But I think Ryan did." Silence. Long silence. Then I asked the question. "How sure are you?" "Not sure enough to accuse anyone." "That's not what I asked." Daniel paused. 90%. Now things were changing. Not dramatically. Not yet. But the puzzle pieces were beginning to fit together. Questions about assets. Questions about inheritance. Property valuation requests. Ownership inquiries. Estate planning discussions. Each piece alone meant very little. Together they created a picture, an incomplete picture, but a picture nonetheless. And that's when Daniel removed his glasses. If you've never met an accountant, that detail may sound meaningless. Trust me, it wasn't. Daniel only removed his glasses when he was about to say something important. "Kevin." "Yeah. If I were you, I'd start keeping records." "What kind of records?" "Everything." "Phone calls?" "Yes." "Emails?" "Yes." "Texts?" "Yes." "Why?" Daniel looked directly at me. "Because I think your son may be preparing for something." I felt cold. Not angry. Not yet. Just cold. And for the first time since this whole thing began, I stopped asking whether Ryan's behavior was unusual. Instead, I started asking a different question. What exactly was he planning? The answer arrived 3 weeks later, and it came disguised as a business opportunity. 3 weeks after Daniel told me to start documenting everything, Ryan showed me exactly why. The invitation arrived on a Wednesday afternoon. Not an email, not a text, a phone call. That alone caught my attention. People only call these days when someone dies, someone gets engaged, or someone wants something, sometimes all three. "Hey, Dad." "Ryan. You free this weekend?" "Depends." "Want to take a drive?" Now that was unusual. When your 41-year-old son suddenly wants to spend an entire day with you, you pay attention. Not because it's impossible, because it's rare. "What kind of drive?" I asked. "Just you and me." "Sounds suspicious." He laughed, a little too hard. "Come on." I agreed. Saturday morning, he picked me up in a black GMC Sierra Denali that probably cost more than my first 3 vehicles combined. The truck smelled like leather and expensive decisions. We headed west toward Estes Park. The mountains were beautiful that morning. Late spring, blue sky, patchy snow still visible on the higher peaks. For a while, everything felt normal. We talked about football, weather, Emma's school, nothing unusual. Then about 20 minutes before reaching Estes Park, Ryan casually brought up the cabin. Again. You know that feeling when someone keeps accidentally mentioning the same topic? Eventually you stop believing it's accidental. "So," he said, staring at the road, "have you thought any more about selling the cabin?" There it was. I looked out the window, pretended to think. "No. Why not?" "Because I like owning it." "Do you even use it much anymore?" "Enough." "You could get a really good price right now." I smiled. "That's what you said last time. And the time before that." His jaw tightened slightly. Small detail. Easy to miss. Not if you're looking. "I just think it's worth considering." Why? That question seemed to bother him. Because people with good motives usually have simple answers. People with hidden motives often need a moment. "It's practical." There was that word again. Practical. Thinking ahead. Simplifying. The same collection of phrases kept appearing. Different conversations. Same vocabulary. Eventually we reached the cabin. The old place looked exactly the way I loved it. Weathered wood siding, stone chimney, green metal roof, a front porch Linda used to decorate every fall. The pine trees surrounding it were taller now. Everything else felt the same. For a few minutes, Ryan seemed genuinely nostalgic. We walked through the rooms. He pointed at old photographs, talked about childhood memories, even laughed about the time he tried to cook pancakes at age 12 and nearly started a fire. For a little while, I almost forgot my concerns. Then we sat on the deck, and the real conversation began. I've actually been talking to someone. There it was, the setup. About what? The property? Of course. He pulled out his phone, opened several documents, property estimates, market reports, sales comparisons, professional-looking materials. Almost too professional. Look at these numbers. I did. The estimates ranged between $612,000 and $670,000. The cabin had appreciated significantly. Colorado real estate had done what Colorado real estate tends to do. Become expensive. Ryan pointed at the screen. You could sell now. Maybe. Invest the money. Maybe. Make life easier. Maybe. The word maybe was becoming my favorite response. He hated it. I could tell. Then he made a mistake. A small one. But small mistakes matter, especially when greed is involved. Actually, he said, I might know someone interested. I looked at him. Someone, an investment group. Already? His expression froze. Just briefly, but long enough. The cabin wasn't even officially listed. I hadn't agreed to sell. Yet somehow there was already a potential buyer. Interesting. That was fast. He shrugged. Connections. Maybe. Maybe not. The conversation moved on. But the comment stayed with me. That evening after I returned to Fort Collins, I called Daniel. What did he say? Daniel asked. I told him everything, especially the part about the mysterious buyer. Daniel became very quiet. That was never a good sign. What are you thinking? I asked. I'm thinking I'd like the name of that investment group. Why? Because curiosity is healthy. No, really. Another pause. Then, because something feels off. The next morning, Daniel called back. Sunday, 8:03 a.m. accountants should not be making investigative phone calls on Sunday mornings. That alone concerned me. Kevin, you found something. Maybe. I sat down. What? The company. What about it? It exists. Okay? It was formed 11 months ago. So, silence. Then, I think you should come see me. That sentence immediately raised my blood pressure. By noon, I was sitting across from Daniel in his office. He handed me a folder. Inside were public records, business registrations, ownership filings, addresses. Nothing illegal, nothing dramatic, at least at first glance. Then I saw it. One phone number, a familiar one, Ryan's office number. I stared at the page, then looked up. Daniel nodded. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally, I broke the silence. Tell me I'm reading that wrong. I don't think you are. The investment company interested in my cabin was connected to a real estate holding LLC. The LLC was connected to another entity. That entity listed Ryan's office contact number. Not directly, not obviously, but clearly enough for someone who knew how to follow records. And that's when everything shifted. Until that moment, I'd been operating under one assumption. Ryan was interested in my assets. Now a second possibility appeared. Ryan wasn't just interested. Ryan might be positioning himself to acquire them. My chest felt heavy. Not because of the money. The cabin mattered. But the money wasn't the issue. The issue was trust. Stay with me here. People often think betrayal begins when someone lies. It doesn't. Betrayal begins the moment someone decides you don't deserve the truth. That's what hurts. That's what lingers. I sat there staring at the paperwork. Daniel remained silent. Eventually, I asked the obvious question. "What do we do?" His answer surprised me. "Nothing." I blinked. "Nothing? Not yet. Why? Because right now, all we have is a pattern." He tapped the folder. No crime, no fraud, no proof. Just evidence that Ryan was becoming increasingly interested in controlling what happened to my property. Daniel leaned forward, then said something that changed the course of the entire story. "Kevin, if he's planning something, he'll make another mistake." "What if he doesn't?" Daniel smiled. "The closest thing accountants have to confidence." "He will." "How do you know?" "Because greed makes people impatient." Then he pointed at the folder. "And impatient people always rush." Looking back now, that was probably the most important prediction anyone made, because Ryan's next mistake would be far bigger, far harder to explain away. And once I saw it, I finally understood this wasn't about helping his father. This was about getting ahead of an inheritance. The problem for Ryan was simple. He thought he was the only person quietly paying attention. He had completely forgotten what I used to do for a living. And that mistake was about to become very expensive. The strange thing about family problems is that they rarely happen all at once. They arrive in layers. One uncomfortable conversation, one odd decision, one moment that doesn't quite make sense, then another and another, until one day you look back and realize the road changed direction miles ago. About a month after Daniel discovered the connection between Ryan and the LLC interested in my cabin, I received an invitation to dinner. Ryan's house. Friday evening, Ashley was making steaks. Emma wanted Grandpa there. Under normal circumstances, that last reason would have been enough. So I went. The drive from Fort Collins to Denver took a little over an hour that evening. Traffic was light. The sun was setting over the Front Range. I remember feeling strangely nervous. Not because I expected a confrontation, because I didn't. That's what worried me. When people hide agendas, they usually become friendlier. Not colder, friendlier. I arrived at 6:12 p.m. Ashley opened the door. "Kevin, come in." The house looked different. Again. Something was always being upgraded. New furniture, new artwork, new lighting fixtures. At one point, I suspected half of Denver's remodeling industry was being personally funded by my daughter-in-law. The newest project was the kitchen. Ashley proudly gave me a tour. New quartz countertops, new cabinets, new appliances, new everything. The refrigerator had a touchscreen larger than the television I grew up with. I nodded politely. "No expense spared." Ashley smiled. "Life's too short." Interesting philosophy, particularly from someone who discussed budgets every time restaurant bills arrived. Ryan appeared carrying a bottle of wine. "Glad you made it." Emma threatened to stop speaking to me if I didn't. Smart kid. Definitely got that from her grandfather. For a moment, everything felt normal, comfortable. Then Emma came running downstairs. And suddenly all my worries disappeared, at least temporarily. "Grandpa." She launched herself at me like a guided missile. I nearly dropped my jacket. Now at 69 years old, there aren't many things capable of instantly improving your mood. A 12-year-old granddaughter who genuinely loves seeing you is one of them. Emma grabbed my hand. "I have to show you something." "Is it another science project?" "No." "Good." The last one nearly exploded. She laughed, then dragged me upstairs. The project turned out to be a short story she'd written for school. 5 pages, handwritten, about a mountain ranger and a rescue dog. Was it perfect? Absolutely not. Did I tell her it was brilliant? Absolutely. That's what grandparents are for. By the time we came downstairs, dinner was ready. The 5 of us sat around a large dining table overlooking the backyard. For the first 20 minutes, conversation stayed harmless. School, weather, football, vacation plans. Then Ryan shifted gears, smoothly, almost professionally. You know that moment when a salesperson begins steering a conversation toward the actual pitch? It felt exactly like that. So, Dad, there it was. I took a sip of iced tea. Yeah. How's everything going? Good. House okay? Yep. Health okay? Yep. Finances okay. There it was. Again. Always the same destination. Different route. Same destination. Far as I know, Ashley joined in. Have you thought any more about simplifying things? I almost smiled. Simplifying. That word again. I was beginning to suspect it appeared in their marriage vows. Depends what you mean. The house? The cabin? The investments? Ryan leaned back, trying to appear casual, trying a little too hard. I noticed. So did Ashley. The problem with deceptive people is that they assume nobody notices their effort. But effort is often the giveaway. Before I could answer, Emma interrupted. Thankfully. Grandpa, tell them about the raccoon. I laughed. The raccoon? The one from last summer. Now that's a story. Last summer, a raccoon somehow got into the cabin. It stole half a package of hamburger buns, knocked over a lamp, and then became trapped inside a bathroom. I spent 3 hours negotiating with a criminal who weighed 18 pounds. Emma loved that story. Ryan did not, because it shifted attention away from financial discussions. I told it anyway. For 5 glorious minutes, everyone laughed. Even Ashley. Even Ryan. For a moment we looked like a family again, the kind Linda would have recognized, the kind she spent decades protecting. Then dinner ended, and the real entertainment began. Ashley announced she wanted to make espresso. That should have been my warning. Now, I don't drink espresso. Never have. Coffee should come in a mug large enough to support emotional recovery. Espresso arrives in containers designed for doll houses. Ashley handed me a small cup, then demonstrated the machine. The thing looked like it belonged inside a laboratory. Buttons, settings, digital displays, probably capable of launching satellites. Want to try? She asked. No? Come on. Against my better judgment, I agreed. 30 seconds later, I accidentally activated what appeared to be every function simultaneously. Steam shot out one side. Milk foam exploded out another. Something beeped aggressively. Emma laughed so hard she nearly fell off her chair. Nancy later referred to the incident as the dairy disaster of Denver. The nickname stuck. For a few minutes the kitchen was chaos, everybody laughing, cleaning, relaxing. And during that moment I saw something important. Ryan wasn't laughing, naturally. He was distracted, watching me, evaluating, waiting, the way someone watches a test they're hoping to pass. That bothered me more than all the financial questions, because it felt personal, like he wasn't seeing his father anymore, just an obstacle between himself and a future outcome. Later that evening, as I prepared to leave, Emma walked me to the front door. Then she hugged me, tight, the kind of hug children eventually stop giving. Love you, Grandpa. Love you too. Promise you'll come back soon. I hesitated. Not because I didn't want to, because suddenly I wasn't sure what I was walking back into. Of course, she smiled, then disappeared upstairs. I stood there for a second, watching, thinking. Ryan appeared beside me. Drive safe. Will do. Neither of us moved. Then he spoke, quietly. Have you ever thought about what happens if something happens to you? There it was. No disguise, no detour. Straight to the point. I looked at him. Really looked at him. The expensive watch, the tailored jacket, the impatience hiding behind concern. And for the first time I realized something. Ryan wasn't waiting for an inheritance. He was planning for one. There is a difference, a very important difference. I drove back to Fort Collins that night with a knot in my stomach. Not because I feared losing money, not because I feared losing property, because I feared losing my son, and that fear nearly convinced me to ignore everything. Nearly. If Emma hadn't hugged me at that door, I might have confronted Ryan right then. I might have demanded answers. I might have blown apart everything before the truth fully surfaced. Instead, I stayed patient. The old auditor in me won. And a few weeks later, Ryan would make a decision so reckless that patience would become my greatest advantage. The official court papers arrived on a Monday. Naturally, bad news loves Mondays. I found the envelope in my mailbox at 2:17 in the afternoon after returning from Silver Grill Cafe. At first I assumed it was junk mail. Then I noticed the law firm's return address. My stomach dropped. Not because I knew what was inside, because I suddenly suspected I did. I carried the envelope into the kitchen, set it beside the coffee maker, stared at it for nearly 5 minutes. Sometimes people think courage means charging forward. At 69, I've learned courage often looks like opening an envelope you already know will hurt. Eventually, I sat down, opened it, and read every page, twice. The first feeling wasn't anger. It was disbelief. The second was sadness. The third was something much colder. The petition claimed that concerns existed regarding my ability to independently manage my financial affairs. It suggested intervention, oversight, protection. The language was careful, professional, legal, but the meaning was simple. My son was asking a court to help him gain control over decisions that belonged to me. I sat there staring at the pages. Outside, a lawnmower hummed somewhere down the street. A dog barked. Life continued. Meanwhile, my entire understanding of my relationship with Ryan shifted. Stay with me here. The financial questions had bothered me. The cabin situation had worried me. But those things still existed in the realm of possibility. This document was different. This was action. This was intent. Someone had spent money preparing this. Someone had met with attorneys. Someone had assembled arguments. Someone had decided I was a problem that needed solving, and that someone was my son. I read the petition again. One sentence stood out. The filing implied that I was becoming vulnerable to poor financial decision-making. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because the irony nearly broke my brain. I had spent 3 decades investigating poor financial decisions. My entire career had been built on identifying them. Yet somehow I was now being presented as someone incapable of recognizing them. That evening I called Ryan. The conversation lasted exactly 6 minutes and 42 seconds. Yes, I timed it. Old habits. He answered on the 3rd ring. Hey, Dad. Not nervous, not guilty, normal. That somehow made it worse. I received the court filing. Silence. Then, okay. Not, I'm sorry. Not, let's talk. Just, okay. I remember staring at the wall, trying to understand how we'd reached this point. What exactly are you doing, Ryan? Another pause. Then came the explanation. The rehearsed explanation. The attorney-approved explanation. We're worried about you. There it was again. Concern. Always concern. Wrapped around control. I've never missed a bill payment. I know. I've never had debt problems. I know. I've never shown signs of cognitive decline. I know. So what exactly are you worried about? Silence. Longer this time. Finally, we just want to protect you. Protect me. The conversation ended shortly afterward. Neither of us raised our voices. Neither of us argued, which somehow made everything worse, because calm conversations leave no place to hide from the truth. That night, I barely slept. Not because of the lawsuit, because of the memories. I kept thinking about Ryan at 8 years old, Ryan at 15, Ryan at 22, the different versions of him I'd known, trying to figure out where this one came from, trying to identify the exact moment a son begins viewing his father as an obstacle. I never found that moment. Maybe there isn't one. Maybe change happens gradually enough that nobody notices until the destination appears. The next morning I visited Nancy. Actually, that's not true. Nancy visited me, because apparently sadness is detectable from several zip codes away. She knocked on my front door carrying 2 coffees and a bag of cinnamon rolls, without asking permission. Very on brand for Nancy. She sat at my kitchen table, read the filing, then removed her reading glasses. Dangerous sign. What an idiot. That was her professional legal assessment. Nancy. What? He's still my son. He's suing you. Technically, Kevin. I stopped. She wasn't angry. She was hurt. For me. There's a difference. After a while, she softened. You okay? That question nearly broke me. Not because I wasn't okay, because somebody finally asked. I nodded. Mostly. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. No speeches, no dramatic advice. Just kindness. Sometimes that's enough. Later that afternoon, I met Daniel. His reaction was very different. Nancy reacted emotionally. Daniel reacted mathematically. He read the filing, twice, then placed it neatly on the desk. Interesting. That's accountant language for disaster. Interesting how several claims lack supporting evidence. Good. No. It means they expect something. I frowned. What? They expect you to panic. That stopped me, because he was right. The filing was built around assumptions. Assumptions that I would react emotionally. Assumptions that I would defend myself poorly. Assumptions that age automatically creates vulnerability. Daniel folded his hands. Kevin? Yeah. Do you trust me? Yes. Good. Then he asked a question that changed everything. One simple question. Do you want to win? I stared at him. Of course. He shook his head. No. What? That's not what I asked. I sat quietly. Then he repeated it. Do you want to win? Something in his tone told me this wasn't about the lawsuit. Not really. What are you asking? Daniel leaned forward. Do you want to beat Ryan? I didn't answer. Because I didn't. Not exactly. I wasn't interested in humiliating my son. I wasn't interested in revenge. I wasn't interested in destroying him. I just wanted him to stop, to understand, to see what he was becoming. Daniel nodded slowly, as if he already knew my answer. Then he asked the second question, the important one. Do you want to win? Or do you want him to understand? The room went quiet. I looked out the office window. Cars moving through traffic, people living ordinary lives. Meanwhile, my own life had become something I barely recognized. The answer took a while. Finally, I spoke. I want both. Daniel smiled. That's harder. I know, but possible. That was the moment we stopped reacting and started preparing. A few days later, Ryan officially retained Victoria Hayes. 36 years old, sharp, ambitious, very successful. Everything I'd later learned suggested she wasn't dishonest, just overconfident. And overconfidence is expensive, especially when your client isn't telling you everything. Around the same time, I hired Rebecca Sullivan, 58, calm, methodical, the kind of attorney who never wasted words. When she first reviewed the filing, she said exactly 12 words. 12 if you count contractions. Not that I counted. She looked up from the papers, then said, "This case is weaker than they think." That felt good, for about 10 seconds. Then reality returned, because regardless of legal strategy, one fact remained unchanged. My son had chosen this path, and before any courtroom battle could begin, Daniel and I still needed answers. More importantly, we needed evidence, because if Ryan was willing to file this petition, there was only one question left. How far was he willing to go? The answer would arrive sooner than any of us expected. And when it did, even I wasn't prepared for it. If you've ever watched somebody walk confidently into a trap they don't know exists, you understand the strange mixture of emotions that comes with it. Part satisfaction, part sadness, part disbelief. Because no matter how much damage they cause, some part of you still wishes they would stop before it's too late. That's how I felt during the months leading up to the hearing. Ryan thought he was gathering leverage. What he didn't realize was that every move he made pushed us closer to a truth he couldn't see. And the reason he couldn't see it had a name. Sarah Brooks, my wife, his mother. You see, the biggest mistake Ryan made wasn't underestimating me. It was forgetting his mother. Most people leave behind memories. Sarah left behind plans. She was like that, organized, thoughtful, always thinking 10 years ahead, 20 if possible. About 6 years before she passed away, she sat me down at our kitchen table one Sunday afternoon. I remember exactly where we were sitting. The old oak table, 2 cups of coffee, 1 legal pad, and a conversation I initially didn't want to have. Estate planning. I hated the topic. Still do. Sarah didn't. "Kevin," she said, "one day we're not going to be here. Can we talk about literally anything else?" No. That was Sarah. Gentle, loving, completely impossible to redirect. Over the next year, she worked with attorneys, accountants, and financial planners. Not because we were wealthy, because she was practical. She wanted things protected, organized, simple. Most importantly, she wanted future decisions insulated from future emotions. At the time, I didn't fully appreciate what she was doing. Years later, I would. More than she ever imagined. A trust was created. Nothing secretive, nothing unusual, perfectly legal, perfectly documented. Its purpose was straightforward. Protect assets, support family, provide educational opportunities, preserve charitable contributions. Sarah cared about deeply. That included a future college fund for Emma and a scholarship fund benefiting students through a local community foundation in Larimer County. Ryan knew generally that estate planning existed. What he didn't know was how much had already been completed, or how thoroughly. Because back then he wasn't interested, and Sarah never believed in forcing information on people who didn't want it. The trust existed quietly, like a foundation beneath a house. Most people never think about it until it becomes important. A week after the court filing, Rebecca, Daniel, and I met in Rebecca's office. It was one of the most boring rooms in Colorado, which I considered reassuring. No dramatic artwork, no fancy furniture, just shelves filled with legal books and enough paperwork to suffocate optimism. Rebecca reviewed several documents, then looked at me. "Has Ryan ever requested copies of trust records?" "No." "Beneficiary summaries?" "No." "Distribution schedules?" "No." Daniel smiled, a small smile, dangerous. "What?" I asked. "He doesn't know." Rebecca nodded. "I agree." That realization changed the entire strategy. Not because we were hiding anything, because Ryan had built assumptions on incomplete information. He believed he understood my assets. He didn't. He believed he understood ownership structures. He didn't. He believed he understood what would happen if he gained financial control. He definitely didn't. Stay with me here. This part matters. People often confuse assets with ownership. But ownership isn't always simple. That's especially true when trust's estate planning tools and long-term family structures exist. Ryan was looking at visible assets: the house, the cabin, investment accounts, insurance policies. What he wasn't seeing was the framework beneath them, the structure Sarah helped build years earlier, the structure Daniel maintained, the structure Rebecca fully understood. And that structure was about to become extremely important. Over the next several months, Daniel assembled records. Not because we expected a courtroom battle, because we refused to walk into one unprepared. Every statement, every filing, every tax return, every trust document, every property record, everything. One afternoon, I visited Daniel's office and found stacks of organized folders covering nearly an entire conference table. Good grief. Daniel didn't look up. This is the condensed version. I stared. Condensed? Very. Accountants are terrifying people. A few weeks later, another piece of information surfaced, one that bothered me deeply. Ryan had apparently discussed future inheritance expectations with at least one financial advisor. Nothing illegal, again, but revealing. Daniel obtained publicly available references connected to planning conversations. The details weren't especially important. The attitude was. The assumption underlying everything was simple. Ryan behaved as though eventual control of certain assets was inevitable. Not possible, not likely, inevitable. That distinction matters, because expectation creates entitlement, and entitlement creates impatience. Meanwhile, life continued, which felt strange. On Tuesdays, I still met Nancy for breakfast. On Thursdays, I still drove past Horsetooth Reservoir. I still changed air filters, paid utility bills, argued with weeds in my backyard. The ordinary parts of life refuse to stop just because something painful is happening. One morning, Nancy asked a question. How are you really doing? Not legally, not financially, emotionally. I appreciated that. I took a moment before answering. Honestly, please, I miss who Ryan used to be. Nancy nodded. No interruption, no advice. So I continued. I keep waiting to see the kid who used to build forts in the living room. The kid's still there. I think adulthood sometimes buries people under layers of bad priorities. That stayed with me, because I wanted it to be true. I still do, even now. Later that week, Emma called unexpectedly. One of the best things about grandchildren is that they rarely care about adult drama. To them, relationships are simple. Grandpa? Hey, kiddo. Are you coming to my soccer game next month? There it was, the easiest question in the world. Of course. Promise? Promise. She sounded relieved. Then she asked something else, something innocent, something that broke my heart. Why does Dad seem stressed whenever he talks about you? I closed my eyes. Children notice more than adults realize. Sometimes grown-ups disagree. About what? I smiled sadly. If I knew how to explain that properly, I'd probably be smarter than I am. She laughed, thankfully, then changed the subject. After we hung up, I sat quietly for a long time, because Emma represented the one thing I refused to lose sight of, the future, the entire reason Sarah created the trust, the entire reason we were protecting things properly, not money, not property, people, always people. Months passed, documents accumulated, evidence strengthened, and Ryan kept moving forward, confident, certain, completely unaware that the strongest piece of the entire puzzle remained invisible to him. By the time hearing preparations began, Rebecca felt comfortable. Daniel felt prepared. Even I felt surprisingly calm, because for the first time since this began, I understood something important. This case wasn't about proving I had assets. It was about proving Ryan never truly understood them. And on the morning of the hearing, as I put on a navy sweater and prepared to leave for the courthouse, one thought kept returning to me. Ryan believed he was walking into that courtroom with all the answers. The problem was that he didn't even know the real question. The hearing took place on a Tuesday morning in Larimer County, October 14th, 9:00 a.m. I remember the date because certain days divide your life into before and after. This was one of them. I arrived early. That wasn't nervousness. That was habit. People who spend years reviewing financial records develop an irrational fear of being late. The courthouse stood under a pale Colorado sky. Cold enough for a jacket, not cold enough for gloves. I parked my Tacoma in the public lot across the street and sat inside for a minute before getting out. Not to gather courage, to gather perspective. There is a difference. For 18 months, this situation had occupied my thoughts, consumed conversations, filled filing cabinets. Now everything was about to become real. I looked at a photograph of Sarah I kept tucked inside my wallet. Just for a second. Then I put the wallet away and headed inside. Security took less than 5 minutes. By 8:31 a.m., I was sitting outside the courtroom with Rebecca Sullivan. She looked exactly the way she always looked. Calm, prepared, unbothered. I once asked her if anything ever made her nervous. She answered, unprepared clients. Fortunately, I wasn't one of them. A few minutes later, Daniel arrived carrying a worn brown leather briefcase, the same one he'd used for years. The thing looked older than some federal regulations. Morning, he said. Morning. You sleep? Not really. Good. I stared at him. Good. You'll remember everything. Accountants are strange people. At 8:47 a.m., Ryan appeared, alongside Victoria Hayes. And for the first time in months, I saw my son face to face. Really face to face. Not through paperwork, not through legal filings, not through second-hand reports. Directly. The sight hit harder than I expected, because he looked nervous, not guilty, not ashamed, nervous, which meant he still believed there was something significant at stake. Victoria looked considerably more confident. Dark navy blazer, leather portfolio, purposeful stride, the expression of someone who expected a routine victory. She nodded politely toward Rebecca. Professional courtesy. Nothing more. Ryan glanced at me. Our eyes met. For one brief second, I thought he might walk over, maybe sit down, maybe talk, maybe remember that before any of this happened, we were father and son. Instead, he looked away. That hurt more than the lawsuit ever did. Stay with me here. People often imagine betrayal as some dramatic explosion. Most of the time, it's quieter. A glance avoided, a call not returned, a conversation that never happens. Those are the moments you remember. Court proceedings started shortly after 9. The courtroom itself wasn't especially impressive. Wood paneling, American flag, state flag, rows of benches, fluorescent lighting that somehow made everyone look slightly tired. Judge Lorraine Whitaker entered promptly at 9:02. She was known throughout the county for two things: efficiency and intolerance for nonsense. Neither quality would help Ryan that day. The preliminary introductions were routine: names, appearances, procedural matters. Then Victoria stood, confident, smooth, prepared, and immediately began presenting Ryan's position. I listened carefully. Not because I hadn't seen the filings, because spoken arguments reveal things documents don't. Victoria described concerns regarding my financial management, my age, my vulnerability, my supposed need for oversight. The language remained respectful. The implications did not. Ryan sat beside her, hands folded, avoiding eye contact. Meanwhile, Rebecca took notes. Daniel remained seated several rows behind us. Quiet, invisible, exactly where we wanted him. For nearly 20 minutes, Victoria spoke. And honestly, she was good, very good. If I hadn't known the facts, I might have found her convincing. That's what made the situation sad. She wasn't lying, at least not intentionally. She was working with information supplied by her client, information she believed, information she had no reason to question. Yet. Then came the moment you've been waiting for since the beginning, the moment I still replay in my mind. Victoria turned toward the judge, opened a folder, then delivered the statement that eventually became the title of this entire story. Your Honor, Mr. Brooks has virtually no meaningful assets requiring independent management. His remaining holdings are limited, uncomplicated, and would be better protected through appropriate oversight. There it was, exactly as she said it. Virtually no meaningful assets. I almost smiled, not because the statement was offensive, because it was catastrophically wrong. Across the room, Ryan visibly relaxed. The words had reassured him, strengthened him, confirmed everything he believed. That was his mistake. You know that feeling when somebody confidently answers a question incorrectly. Not slightly incorrectly, spectacularly incorrectly. That's what this felt like. I slowly turned my head, just slightly, toward the gallery, toward the third row, toward Daniel Carter. Daniel was sitting quietly with that same old briefcase, hands folded, expression neutral, waiting. The image would have been funny if the situation weren't so serious, because the single person most qualified to challenge Victoria's statement was sitting directly behind her, and she didn't even know it. Rebecca noticed my glance. A tiny smile appeared, then disappeared, the kind of smile that says, just wait. Meanwhile, Judge Whittaker continued listening. As experienced judges do, she wasn't reacting emotionally. She wasn't accepting arguments. She was evaluating them, separating confidence from evidence, a skill I respected. Several more minutes passed. Victoria expanded on the claim, repeated versions of it, simplified asset structure, limited holdings, minimal complexity. Each statement sounded increasingly dangerous. Not for me, for them, because every repetition made the eventual contradiction worse. Ryan still hadn't looked at me. Not once. That detail matters, because had he looked, he might have noticed something. I wasn't worried, not even slightly. Not because I knew we'd win, because I knew something he didn't. The strongest evidence in the room hadn't been mentioned yet. The most important documents hadn't been introduced yet. The most dangerous witness hadn't been called yet. And the biggest assumption underlying their entire case remained untouched. Then Judge Whittaker adjusted her glasses, looked down at the filings, looked back up, and asked a question. A simple question. The kind that changes everything. "Counselor," she said, looking directly at Victoria, "what documentation supports your characterization of Mr. Brooks' assets?" Silence. Brief, but noticeable. Victoria immediately began reaching for papers, confident, prepared, certain. Ryan straightened in his seat, expecting reinforcement, expecting validation, expecting victory. Instead, they were about to receive something else entirely. Because the moment Judge Whittaker asked for documentation, the case stopped being about opinions and started becoming about facts. That was where Daniel Carter became very dangerous. And within the next few minutes, the entire room would learn why. The atmosphere in the courtroom changed. the moment Judge Whittaker asked for documentation. Not dramatically, not all at once. But if you've spent enough years around investigations, depositions, audits, and legal proceedings, you learn to recognize the shift. The conversation stops being theoretical. It starts becoming factual. And facts are much less cooperative than assumptions. Victoria Hayes recovered quickly. To her credit, she was a skilled attorney. She opened a folder, reviewed several pages, and began explaining the basis for her client's position. Property estimates, financial summaries, public records, general descriptions. Nothing unusual, nothing dishonest. The problem was that none of it actually proved what she had just claimed. Judge Whittaker listened patiently, then asked another question. Has the court been provided with complete asset documentation? Victoria hesitated. Only briefly, but everybody noticed, including Ryan, including me, including Daniel. Not complete documentation, Your Honor. That answer landed heavily, because there is a large difference between reviewing complete records and making assumptions based on partial information. Judge Whittaker nodded, then looked toward Rebecca. Counsel. Rebecca stood, calm, measured, the way she always did. Your Honor, we believe the court has been presented with an incomplete characterization of Mr. Brooks' financial structure. A few heads turned. Ryan sat up straighter. Victoria frowned slightly. Judge Whittaker leaned back. Go on? Rebecca glanced toward me, then toward the gallery. Then she said 7 words that changed everything. We would like to call Daniel Carter. Silence. Pure silence. Ryan turned around. For the first time that morning, he looked directly at Daniel. The expression on his face was something I'll never forget. Confusion, followed by recognition, followed by concern. Daniel stood, picked up his old leather briefcase, and walked calmly toward the witness stand. No drama, no theatrics, just a 60-year-old accountant doing what 60-year-old accountants do, carrying records. Stay with me here. This next part matters. People think courtroom victories happen because somebody gives an emotional speech. Sometimes they do. Most of the time they happen because somebody brings paperwork. Daniel was bringing paperwork. After being sworn in, he settled into the witness chair. Rebecca began with basic questions. Name, profession, years of experience, relationship to me, the foundation. Nothing exciting. Then she moved deeper. Mr. Carter, how long have you managed Mr. Brooks' financial records? 22 years. Were you involved in the preparation and maintenance of his estate planning documents? Yes. Were you involved in the trust structure established by Kevin and Sarah Brooks? Yes. That got attention. Immediate attention. Victoria looked up. Ryan's eyes narrowed. Judge Whittaker made a note. Rebecca continued. Is it accurate to describe Mr. Brooks as possessing virtually no meaningful assets requiring management? Daniel didn't answer immediately. Classic accountant move. First he adjusted his glasses. Then he opened the briefcase. Then he removed a neatly organized stack of documents. Only then did he answer. No. One word. Simple. Devastating. Rebecca nodded. Can you explain? And Daniel did, methodically, patiently, without emotion, the trust structure, the asset organization, the ownership arrangements, the charitable allocations, the educational provisions for Emma, the long-established planning created years earlier. Everything. Not secret, not hidden, not complicated, just completely ignored by Ryan's assumptions. As Daniel spoke, I watched Victoria. To her credit, she wasn't angry. She looked surprised, genuinely surprised, because this was the first time she was hearing portions of the complete picture. That told me something important. Ryan hadn't told her everything, or worse, he hadn't known everything. Both possibilities were bad. Rebecca introduced supporting documentation: trust records, financial statements, property records, tax filings, years of documentation. The kind of documentation only obsessive accountants preserve, which is why God created accountants. Somebody has to remember where every piece of paper lives. Judge Whittaker reviewed several exhibits, then asked questions of her own. Daniel answered every one, clearly, directly, without exaggeration. The more he spoke, the weaker Ryan's position became. Then came the second phase, the part Ryan truly didn't see coming. Rebecca approached the witness stand, holding another folder, this one thinner, much thinner. Sometimes thin folders are the dangerous ones. "Mr. Carter," she asked, "during your review of public records, did you discover anything related to the Estes Park property?" Ryan visibly stiffened. "I noticed. So did the judge." Daniel answered carefully, "Yes." Rebecca held up documents. "Can you explain?" The courtroom grew very quiet. Daniel described the LLC, the registration records, the ownership trail, the contact information. Nothing sensational, just facts, one fact at a time. Then came the detail that mattered. The office phone number, Ryan's office phone number, appearing within documentation connected to the entity interested in purchasing my cabin. Rebecca paused. "To your knowledge, was Mr. Brooks informed of this relationship when discussions about selling the property occurred?" "No." The silence afterward felt enormous. Victoria immediately stood, objected, questioned relevance. Judge Whittaker allowed limited inquiry, and suddenly everybody was paying attention. Ryan no longer looked confident. Now he looked worried. Very worried. Because facts have a nasty habit. Once introduced, they don't care who they embarrass. Then came the moment. The single stupidest mistake greed caused him to make. The mistake Daniel predicted months earlier. Impatience. Rebecca asked another question. Simple. Direct. "Mr. Carter, based on your review, did these records suggest a potential future interest in acquiring the property?" Before Daniel could fully answer, Ryan spoke. Without permission, without thinking, without control. "That cabin was supposed to be mine anyway." The words hung in the air. Every person in the courtroom heard them. Every person. Ryan realized his mistake immediately. You could see it. His face changed. Victoria closed her eyes for half a second, the universal expression of an attorney whose client has just done something profoundly unhelpful. Judge Whittaker looked up, directly at Ryan. "Excuse me?" Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The damage was done. Because that sentence revealed more than 18 months of legal arguments. It revealed motivation, entitlement, expectation, everything. Ryan sank back into his chair, silent. Meanwhile, Daniel simply sat there, waiting, patient, the same way he'd been patient throughout this entire ordeal. The hearing continued for another hour. Questions, documents, clarifications, procedural matters. But honestly, the outcome had already shifted. Not because Ryan was exposed as some criminal mastermind. He wasn't. That was never the story. The story was simpler. Ryan had built an entire legal strategy around assumptions. Assumptions about money, assumptions about inheritance, assumptions about control, and those assumptions collapsed the moment actual evidence entered the room. By the end of the hearing, Judge Whittaker made her position clear. The petition would not be granted. The court found insufficient basis to justify the requested intervention. Additional concerns regarding representations made during proceedings would be reviewed separately. Formal language, powerful meaning. Ryan lost. Victoria gathered her papers quietly. Rebecca thanked the court. Daniel returned documents to his briefcase. And me, I sat there feeling something I hadn't expected. Not triumph, not relief, not satisfaction. At least, not entirely, because after all the evidence, after all the preparation, after all the waiting, I finally looked directly at my son. And what I saw wasn't an enemy. It was a man who had allowed greed to become more important than trust. A man who had spent 18 months chasing control, only to lose something much more valuable. The hearing was over. The legal battle was effectively finished. But the hardest part of the story was only beginning. Because winning in court and healing a family are two very different things. Winning felt good for about 12 seconds, maybe 15, not longer than that. The moment Judge Whitaker finished speaking, I experienced a brief flash of relief, the kind that arrives after months of pressure. Then I looked at Ryan, and the feeling disappeared, because courtrooms settle legal disputes. They don't repair relationships. Ryan remained seated while people began gathering documents. Victoria spoke quietly to him. He nodded once, then stared at the table. I wondered what he was thinking. Anger, embarrassment, regret. Honestly, I still don't know. A part of me hoped he would walk over, not to apologize, just to talk, to say something, anything. But he didn't. Neither did I. Maybe that was a mistake. Maybe it wasn't. Life rarely gives us the luxury of knowing. I watched him leave through the side door. The same son I had taught to ride a bicycle. The same son I had helped move into his first apartment. The same son who once sat on my shoulders during 4th of July fireworks. Now walking away from me like a stranger. That image stayed with me longer than the court victory. Outside the courthouse, the Colorado air felt colder than it had that morning. Rebecca shook my hand. "Congratulations." "Doesn't really feel like it." She nodded. "I understand." And she did. That's one reason I liked Rebecca. She understood that winning and happiness aren't synonyms. Daniel emerged carrying his briefcase. The famous briefcase. The hero of the entire hearing. I pointed at it. "That thing deserves its own parking space." Daniel actually smiled. A rare event. "I'll consider it." "You should." We stood there for a moment. 3 people, 1 legal victory, very little celebration. Then Nancy called. Of course she did. I swear that woman had satellites. "Well, it's over. And we won." Silence. Then, "You sound miserable." "Thanks. I'm serious." "I know." Another pause. Then her voice softened. "You still wish it hadn't happened." "Yeah, I know." That was Nancy. No speeches, no forced optimism, just understanding. The following weeks were strange, quiet, uneasy. Ryan didn't call. I didn't call either. Not because I wanted distance, because I didn't know what to say. Every possible conversation seemed wrong, too angry, too emotional, too soon. Meanwhile, life resumed, or at least pretended to. I returned to Silver Grill, returned to my morning routines, returned to ordinary errands. But something had changed. You don't spend 18 months preparing for conflict, and then instantly become the same person afterward. A month later, Ashley called. That surprised me. We'd never been particularly close. Friendly, respectful, but not close. The call came on a Thursday evening. "Kevin." "Hi, Ashley." She sounded tired. Not angry, not defensive. Just tired. We talked awkwardly for a few minutes. Then she finally got to the point. "Emma's tuition fund." I closed my eyes. There it was, the subject that mattered. Not because of money, because of Emma. "What about it?" "She wants to know if it's still there." The question hurt. Not because Ashley asked it, because somebody had made Emma worry about it. "Of course it's still there." Ashley exhaled. The sound carried relief. Real relief. Thank you. That was never changing. Another pause. Then she quietly said something I didn't expect. I don't think Ryan understood what he was risking. I looked out my kitchen window. The sun was setting, orange light across the backyard. I think he did. You might be right. Then she added, but I don't think he understood what he was losing. That stayed with me. After we hung up, I sat alone for a long time, thinking about the difference. People often understand what they're trying to gain. They rarely understand what they're sacrificing. A few weeks later, Emma visited. Just Emma. Ashley drove her to Fort Collins. We spent the afternoon together. Nothing dramatic. Lunch, board games, a walk around City Park. At one point, she asked whether the cabin was still ours. Ours? I asked. She nodded. I smiled. Yeah, kiddo. The relief on her face nearly broke my heart. That cabin wasn't important because of property values. It was important because of memories. Ryan had forgotten that. Emma hadn't. Before leaving, she handed me a folded piece of paper. A drawing, the cabin, the pine trees, the deck, and stick figures standing outside. One labeled Grandpa, one labeled Emma. I still have it. It's in my desk drawer right now. Actually, it's probably worth more to me than anything discussed in court. Around Christmas, Nancy invited me to dinner. Technically invited. Realistically ordered. Daniel came too, which was rare. Convincing Daniel to attend social events is like convincing a cat to enjoy swimming. Possible, but difficult. We met at Nancy's diner after closing time. The three of us sat in a booth. A small Christmas tree blinking in the corner, snow falling outside. And for the first time in months, I laughed without forcing it. Nancy served pie. Daniel consumed enough pecan pie to concern medical professionals. The evening felt normal, comfortable, human. Eventually, Nancy raised her coffee mug. To Kevin. I groaned. No speeches. Too bad. She pointed at me. You protected what mattered. I started to argue, then stopped. Because she was right. The victory was never about money, never about property, never about proving I was smarter. It was about protecting what Sarah spent years building, protecting Emma's future, protecting choices that belonged to me, protecting dignity, and perhaps most importantly, refusing to let greed rewrite the meaning of family. The truth is, this story doesn't have a perfect ending. Ryan and I didn't magically reconcile. There wasn't some dramatic Christmas apology, no emotional movie scene. Life isn't usually that generous. Today our relationship remains complicated. Better than it was, not what it should be. There are conversations we still need to have. Truths still waiting to be acknowledged. Wounds still healing. But there is one thing I know. I no longer confuse peace with surrender. For a long time I thought avoiding conflict was the same thing as preserving family. It isn't. Sometimes protecting a family means drawing a line, even when it hurts, especially when it hurts. And if Ryan ever truly understands that the door is still open, not because he earned it, because he's my son, and some things are bigger than courtrooms, some things are bigger than money, some things are bigger than winning. Before I end this story, I want to leave you with something. If you've listened this far, I need you to understand something. Life has a way of testing people through the relationships they value most. Sometimes the people who hurt us aren't enemies. They're people we love who make selfish choices. And sometimes the hardest lesson is realizing that protecting yourself is not the same thing as betraying someone else. Don't confuse kindness with weakness. Don't confuse patience with ignorance. And never assume that staying silent means someone doesn't see exactly what's happening. Most importantly, don't measure family by what you expect to receive from them. Measure family by what you're willing to protect, even when it's difficult. The people who truly love you won't see you as a future transaction. They'll see you as a person. And that's a difference worth remembering. If this story meant something to you, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more real, raw, and family-centered stories. Drop a comment below and tell us, have you ever been in a situation like this? We read every single one. And as always, thank you for being a part of this.